Good afternoon, class. I would like to talk today about the Second Amendment. Uh, I think we can all appreciate that in our culture today, the Second Amendment has been a hotly debated issue. There's people on each side of the aisle that feel extraordinarily strongly, one way or another, about how we should currently understand the Second Amendment and how the Second Amendment was even understood in its day. So with that, I'd like to say that the Second Amendment was ratified in 1791, and it states that a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In an article we read this week by Robert Shalhoub, written in 1982, he says, "Since its ratification in 1791, the Second Amendment has remained in relative obscurity. Virtually ignored by the Supreme Court, the amendment has been termed obsolete, defunct, and an unused provision with no meaning for the 20th century by scholars dealing with the Bill of Rights." We know that today this amendment gets a lot of attention. Each person or each camp on the side of their perspective views gets quite excited about this conversation. On one side, you have those that are pro-Second Amendment in terms of the individual's right to own and use a gun. And on the other side, you have those that are for gun control. Many believe that each law-abiding citizen is entitled to gun ownership and the legal use of their firearms. And they believe this is the purpose of the Second Amendment. On the other side, according to Shalhoub, they believe that the main focus of the Second Amendment is focused on the militia, that the true purpose of the amendment was to forbid Congress to prohibit the maintenance of a state militia. Therefore, it cannot be transformed into a personal right to bear arms. Shalhoub goes on to state that the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice in 1967 reiterated this belief even more forcefully. It states that the U.S. Supreme Court and the lower federal courts have consistently interpreted this amendment only as a prohibition against federal interference with state militia and not as a guarantee of an individual's right to keep or carry firearms. So, there's quite the division, and all of this over the two phrases of how the amendment is written. A well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. In his article, Shalhoub looks to the 18th century in an effort to understand the history and the ideas that the Founding Fathers pulled upon as they established the Second Amendment. He references Niccolo Machiavelli and articulates that clearly the perspective of Florentine tradition with the 18th century Republican thought they were drawing heavily upon. Machiavelli states that an idealized citizen warrior was the staunchest bulwark of a republic. For Machiavelli, the most dependable protection against corruption was an economic independence of the citizen and the citizen's ability and willingness to become a warrior. They go on to look at Sir Walter Raleigh, articulating sophisms of a tyrant. What was indicative of a tyrant? It was that he would unarm his people of weapons, money, and all means whereby they may resist his power. So according to Sir Walter Raleigh, according to Machiavelli, and these are Florentine writers and political thinkers that the Founding Fathers drew heavily upon, what was important to protect the country or civilization against tyranny, against corruption, was a people who had an economic independence and the ability to defend themselves with weapons. Let's look at the discussion that was in Virginia. Virginians had experienced the danger of disarmament firsthand during the Revolution. Lord Dunmore's attempt to seize the colony's gunpowder and vandalize the militia's muskets more than a decade earlier, left an indelible imprint on the minds of leading opponents of the Constitution, such as Patrick Henry and George Mason. Patrick Henry came to this debate about the Second Amendment and the Constitution quite reluctant as an anti-federalist, and he stated after his own experience with Lord Dunmore that without the protection for the citizens to have weapons, it could be way too easy for someone to be able to come in and take over, and the citizens wouldn't have an ability to defend themselves. They saw how that was, Lord Dunmore had tried to do that to them, and he wanted to ensure protection for future generations that the same thing could not happen to them. With such, the Second Amendment has a very deep history. It has a history from Florentine thought in the Founding Fathers. It has a practical history during the Revolution of the Founding Fathers and them wanting to ensure that future Americans had a right to protect themselves individually and as a people, as a society. These people, these Founding Fathers, wanted to ensure protection against tyranny, against corruption. So, the Second Amendment, a deep history. I am sure that it will have a continued, deep, hot debate from people of different perspectives. But I hope that we can learn to have a civil discussion about how the Founding Fathers understood the importance of the amendment, and when we understand better how they understood the amendment and what the amendment is really has been established to protect, that we can move on in this conversation and then decide based on this if the Second Amendment still has such a deep meaning for us or not. Thank you.